All right, so have you ever been looking at a map, maybe just zoning out a little, and you start thinking, what if? Those kind of crazy scenarios.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think everyone does that from time to time. Maps can really spark the imagination.
Totally. Well, that's kind of what we're doing today, diving into a what if that's honestly pretty out there. We've been going through some really interesting sources, and the question they pose is, well, could the U.S. actually annex Canada, Greenland, and the Panama Canal in 2025, no less?
It's a huge question, and the material lays out all sorts of different paths, right? Like we're talking military action, negotiated deals, even some purely hypothetical stuff.
Exactly. And look, we're not going to get bogged down in like super technical military stuff or political jargon. Okay, we're going to stick to what these sources say about the how, the supposed big wins, and honestly, the massive downsides of something this big, this radical. So, first up, our neighbors to the north, Canada.
Canada,
Hmm.
40 million people, famous for their, well, maple syrup, obviously, hockey, and, generally being on good terms with the U.S. We always say friendly neighbors, but the sources make it clear that doesn't mean it's a simple situation.
You're right. One of the paths they lay out is straight up military annexation. And just on paper, yeah, the U.S. has a more powerful military. But these sources, they immediately throw a wrench in that idea. What are some of the biggest things they point out?
Well, first off, it's pretty unlikely Canada would just surrender. They have a very strong national identity, and the sources suggest there'd be a lot of resistance. Then you've got Canada's social structures, universal health care, for example, and their ties to the UK, the whole Commonwealth thing. It wouldn't be easy or quick.
Not at all. In fact, one source uses the word mess, talking about potential global outrage. And really importantly, it brings up the damage to NATO that's a big deal to consider. Then there's the other side of the coin, the deal scenario, where the U.S. offers Canada some kind of huge economic incentive to join. What's the problem with that line of thinking, according to what we've read?
Simply put, Canada's doing pretty well on its own. They're not in some kind of crisis that would push them towards, well, giving up their sovereignty, especially to a country with, let's be honest, very different politics and social systems. The big question is, from Canada's side, why would they even want to do that?
Makes sense. Now, the sources do mention some potential pros for the U.S. stuff, like access to Canadian oil, their timber, more influence in the Arctic. But what are the cons that really outweigh all that?
The cost alone would be crazy.
Yeah.
Integrating a country of 40 million people with its own systems, its own infrastructure, billions, easily. And you'd have almost guaranteed a huge amount of resentment, anger from Canadians, which would make things very unstable internally, not to mention the whole thing would be a PR nightmare internationally.
You're hitting all the key points. So, looking at all that, the sources are pretty clear about annexing Canada. Maybe a cool idea for some alternate reality, but ultimately not going to happen. All right, let's move on. Next target, Greenland.
Greenland, right? Huge, covered in ice, controlled by Denmark, tiny population, something like 56,000 people. What's interesting is the sources actually mention a historical parallel. Back in 1946, President Truman tried to buy Greenland for $100 million. Makes you wonder what the asking price would be today if Denmark was even selling.
It really does, and the sources lay out a couple of possibilities. First, just a straight-up cash offer. The logic is if Denmark was in really bad financial shape, they might consider it. But there's a big problem with that, right?
Yeah, the sources talk about this growing independence movement in Greenland itself. They might not want to be part of the U.S., even if Denmark was willing to sell. Their goal seems to be self-determination, not just switching who's in charge.
That's a crucial point. Then there's the more aggressive option, a military grab. The sources talk about how important Greenland is strategically, the rare earth minerals, the location for controlling the Arctic. But what would Denmark probably do if the U.S. just tried to take it?
The sources put it pretty bluntly, nope, ours. Denmark's in NATO too, remember, so they'd see this as a huge hostile act. It would mess up alliances, raise all sorts of questions about international law, a whole thing.
So we've got potential pros for the U.S., again, control of a key Arctic territory, valuable resources. But the cons, what are the sources saying about those?
It's kind of similar to Canada. You'd probably have NATO allies pissed off, possible resistance from people in Greenland, and the environmental impact. That's a big one. The sources emphasize a lot of potential damage from resource extraction and military activity in a place like that.
Right, right. So the sources say that basically the U.S. taking Greenland only really works if Denmark is super desperate. Doesn't seem likely in 2025, does it? Okay, let's switch gears completely. the Panama Canal.
Ah, the Panama Canal. Vital for global trade, and the sources remind us the U.S. used to run it until 1999 when they handed it over to Panama. So could they take it back? The sources look at the military option again. Panama's military is pretty small compared to the U.S., so a quick invasion to take control just from a military perspective seems possible. What are the reasons the sources give for the U.S. even wanting to do this?
Well, they talk about controlling those crucial shipping lanes, the strategic importance of that, plus the money the canal makes, something like $2 billion a year in tolls. And of course, there's the whole showing off military power thing in a region that's strategically important. But the sources don't stay excited about this idea for very long, do they?
No, they really don't. The fallout in Latin America would be huge. It would be seen as a blatant attack on a sovereign country, probably condemned by almost everyone in the region. Plus, it'd mean breaking treaties, which has its own international consequences. And the sources also mention the possibility of Panamanians fighting back, like guerrilla warfare, which would make holding on to the canal really difficult.
Okay, so what about a deal this time? U.S. offers Panama a ton of money for the canal. What do the sources say about that?
They're pretty sure it'd be a hard no.
Hmm.
The Panama Canal is a symbol of independence for Panamanians, a source of national pride. It seems very unlikely they'd give it up, no matter the price.
Interesting. So the pros for the U.S. here, more money, more power, are again outweighed by the cons, which are a massive diplomatic mess, and the risk of having a canal that's vulnerable and constantly under threat if there's any kind of conflict. The sources say it's maybe possible, but definitely messy.
Exactly. Now, the sources take us down a really interesting and kind of wild path. The what-if scenario, where the U.S. goes full empire mode and tries to take Canada, Greenland, and the Panama Canal all at the same time. What kind of situation do they say would make something that crazy even happen?
They say it would take a massive global crisis, something like a huge war or catastrophic climate change, something that creates a ton of instability or makes the U.S. feel like it has to do something drastic. And in that situation, they imagine the U.S. just grabbing these strategically vital places. So in that crazy scenario, what are the potential advantages?
In that, well, extremely hypothetical situation, the sources talk about the combined power of all those territories giving the U.S., and I'm quoting here, ultimate superpower vibes. They say Canada's resources, Greenland's location, control of the Panama Canal, all of it together, would basically give the U.S. unmatched power and could lead to a huge economic boom.
But, I mean, the downsides of this full empire thing, they have to be gigantic, right?
They are. The sources talk about global backlash, sanctions from other countries, maybe even military action against the U.S., and then there's the people in those territories probably rebelling, which would be a constant problem, a drain on resources.
Right.
The sources compare it to, and this is a great analogy, playing Risk, but in real life way too much to handle.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to put it. And the chances of it actually happening, the sources are pretty clear about that too, aren't they?
They say, only in a doomsday movie, which tells you how unlikely it is and how disastrous it would probably be if it did happen.
Okay, so big picture time. What's the overall conclusion from these sources about the U.S. annexing Canada, Greenland, and the Panama Canal in 2025?
The sources say that while the U.S. might have the military power to do some of these things, or that some crazy global event could, in theory, make it possible, the consequences would be so bad, wars, international isolation, huge costs, that it's just not likely and, honestly, not a good idea.
And they also bring up a good point, right? The U.S. is already doing okay with Canada. They've got a presence in Greenland. They can use the Panama Canal. So why risk all that stability, all those relationships, for something so disruptive, so potentially dangerous?
That's the key question. The current situation, even if it's not perfect, gives the U.S. a lot of what it might want from those territories, without all the risks and problems of actually taking them over.
So there you have it. We just went deep, deep down the rabbit hole of a truly wild what-if scenario, all inspired by these really interesting sources. We looked at how it might happen, the supposed benefits, and the very real, very serious downsides of the U.S. trying to annex Canada, Greenland, and the Panama Canal.
It really makes you think about the world, doesn't it? The balance of power, the importance of countries being able to decide their own fate, and what it really costs to be a powerful country on the global stage.
And that brings us to the question the sources leave us with. What do you think? After everything we've talked about, how do you feel about this scenario, even though it's super hypothetical?
It's definitely a lot to consider. In a world that's constantly changing, with everything so interconnected, what can we learn from past examples of countries expanding their territory? How does that help us understand what's happening today and what might happen in the future, even if those possibilities seem as unlikely as the ones we've been discussing? There's a lot to think about here.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those questions